a swampy bend in the Mississippi, where French aristocrats, enslaved Africans and Caribbean pirates created a city unlike any other. This is New Orleans, where voodoo queens outsmarted generals, where jazz erupted from oppression, and where every hurricane teaches the same lesson. Laissez-les bon temps ruler, no matter what. The history of New Orleans isn't just American history, it's humanity's story, set to a second-line beat. Blood and betrayal. New Orleans' dark birth in the shadow of empire. In the spring of 1718, the French Mississippi Company, led by Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, founded La Nouvelle-Orléans on the contested lands of the Chitimacha people, unwittingly marking the beginning of a dark saga. The settlement, named after Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, was born from the ruthless ambitions of empires seeking dominion over the New World, as France clashed with Spain, England and the Native American tribes. Among these tribes, the Natchez rose in fierce rebellion, and in 1729, they struck with brutal force, overrunning Fort Rosalie and slaughtering 230 French colonists. The massacre shattered any illusion of safety, casting a long shadow over the fledgling city. In retaliation, French Governor Étienne Purrier waged a merciless campaign to wipe out the Natchez, exterminating their people and scattering their allies, which escalated tensions throughout the region and ignited the Chickasaw Wars. As French forces struggled to maintain control, the indigenous tribes, caught between rival European powers, took advantage of France's weakening grip, raiding settlements with impunity. The late 1740s saw the relentless Chickasaw raids reach as far as Baton Rouge, forcing frightened French settlers to huddle within the walls of New Orleans. This was a city born in bloodshed, betrayal, and the brutal calculus of empire, a place where survival hinged on violent conquest and the ever-shifting allegiances of the tribes who once called this land home. The chains of empire, the dark foundations of New Orleans. The fledgling colony of New Orleans, desperate to secure labor for its burgeoning economy, turned to the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. By the late 1710s, ships laden with enslaved Africans arrived in droves, their bodies sold to build the wealth of the empire. The largest shipment came in 1716, when multiple vessels docked in New Orleans, delivering a horrific cargo that would forever change the city's fabric. By 1724, the number of African slaves had grown so large that laws were institutionalized to govern their lives with chilling efficiency. The Code Noir, established in the 1720s, required slaves to be baptized in the Catholic faith and married in church, ensuring their subjugation was sanctified by religion itself. This code laid the foundation for the brutal systems of slavery that would stain the history of the American South. In the midst of such cruelty, the slaves forged their own distinct culture, Afro-Creole society, where religious practices such as voodoo and the Creole language became enduring symbols of resistance and survival. As New Orleans evolved into a commercial hub of the Atlantic world, its complex cultural mix began to take shape, blending French, African, and indigenous influences. The Ursuline sisters arrived in 1727, establishing a convent that would educate generations of young women, laying the groundwork for New Orleans' deep educational traditions. Yet, beneath this facade of growth and cultural richness, the city's very foundations were built on the unacknowledged suffering of those who had been enslaved, marking the dark and painful origins of the New Orleans we know today. A city of rebellion, the Spanish and revolutionary struggles of New Orleans. New Orleans, a city born of French ambition, was forever marked by its struggle to retain its autonomy, even as shifting imperial hands threatened to undo its essence. After the Treaty of Paris in 1763 ceded Louisiana to Spain, the citizens of New Orleans refused to bow quietly to their new rulers. Despite Spain's claims, the people who had known French rule for so long were adamant in their resistance. In 1768, passions boiled over when a defiant mob spiked the city's guns and seized control, an act of rebellion that sought to restore French dominance in the city. The rebels sailed to Paris with their grievances, but their plea was in vain. King Louis XV reaffirmed Spain's claim over Louisiana, and the rebellion crumbled. Yet, despite Spanish rule, the heart of New Orleans remained fiercely French in its culture and its spirit, as seen in the architectural marvels of the Vieux-Carre, much of which was shaped by Spanish colonial policies. It was during these turbulent times that the city also became a covert hub for revolutionary activity, with New Orleans merchants smuggling supplies to the American rebels fighting for independence. Filipino settlers, arriving in the 1760s, added another layer to the city's cultural complexity. But it was in 1779, with the guidance of the intrepid Bernardo de Galvez, that New Orleans finally made its mark on the Revolutionary War, as the Count of Galvez led a victorious southern campaign against the British. In this time of conflict, the city's future was forged, an amalgamation of French, Spanish and revolutionary influences, each leaving its dark and indelible mark on the soul of New Orleans. The Surge of Souls, New Orleans in the Wake of Empire. The dawn of the 19th century found New Orleans caught in the tumult of empires. The Third Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800 briefly restored French rule over the city in Louisiana, but Napoleon's ambitions turned to other conquests, leading to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. With the land now in the hands of the United States, New Orleans experienced a rapid influx of new inhabitants, Americans, French, Creoles and Africans, each bringing their own legacy to the city. As sugar and cotton plantations flourished, built upon the backs of enslaved laborers, the city's population swelled with waves of immigrants seeking refuge and opportunity. Among them were thousands of Saint Dominican refugees fleeing the Haitian Revolution, a migration that would forever alter the city's cultural fabric. They brought with them not only their language and customs but their laborers, slaves and free people of color, turning New Orleans into a melting pot of racial and social complexities. The tensions between the French Creoles who welcomed these refugees and the United States officials, who sought to restrict the influx of free black people, grew as the city's demographics shifted dramatically. By 1809, the Saint Dominican exodus doubled the city's population, making it a city that was more than half black, a startling fact in the context of the South. The horrors of slavery and the shadow of revolution loomed large over the port city, and in the whirlwind of migration, New Orleans became an island of cultural fusion, a city defined by contradictions, where race, power and identity intertwined in a complex, often painful struggle for belonging and survival. The Unheard Roar, the 1811 Slave Rebellion of New Orleans. In the winter of 1811, a storm of defiance rose from the soil of Louisiana, fueled by the anguish of hundreds of enslaved Africans who could no longer bear the brutal chains of their captivity. Between January 8th and 11th, 500 men and women, bound by the horrors of forced labor, rose in rebellion against their enslavers in St. Charles and St. John the Baptist parishes. They fought not only for their lives but for a fleeting moment of freedom, leaving death in their wake as they killed 2 white men in their desperate bid for liberation. With fire in their hearts, they marched south toward New Orleans, determined to take their destiny into their own hands. But their march was met with a ruthless counterforce. The local militia descended upon them with merciless force, leading to a violent confrontation that left blood and bodies scattered across the land. The rebellion was crushed, but not without cost, as the rebellious enslaved were either killed or captured, their courage silenced but never forgotten. This uprising, the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history, became an unsettling testament to the depths of oppression and the unyielding spirit of those who had nothing left to lose. It reverberated through the streets of New Orleans, a haunting reminder that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the will to resist can never be fully extinguished. The battle for the soul of New Orleans, the 1815 Clash of Titans. The fate of New Orleans, and perhaps even the future of a young, fragile nation, hung in the balance as the final chapter of the War of 1812 unfurled in a moment of brutal conflict. The British, determined to secure control of the port city and dominate the Mississippi River, marshaled a force of 11,000 seasoned soldiers under the command of Sir Edward Pakenham, their eyes fixed on the prize. But they underestimated the fierce resolve of General Andrew Jackson, a man who had come from humble beginnings and was now tasked with defending the heart of America's future. Despite limited resources and overwhelming odds, Jackson cobbled together a ragtag army, militiamen from Louisiana and Mississippi, U.S. Army regulars, Tennessee State Militia, Kentucky frontiersmen, and even local privateers led by the infamous pirate Jean Lafitte. On January 8, 1815, as the British surged forward with deadly precision, Jackson's men stood firm in the muck and mire of the battlefield. The Americans, outnumbered and untested in the harsh theater of war, fought with an unyielding fury, repelling the British advance with a stunning, decisive force. The battle was short but explosive, with casualties mounting on both sides, as the British were decisively defeated in what became one of the most iconic military victories in American history. What neither side knew was that the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed weeks earlier, officially ending the war. Yet, this monumental clash, the Battle of New Orleans, raged on in defiance of peace, as both sides were unaware of the ceasefire that had already been agreed upon. For the British, it was a bitter defeat, one that would forever stain their pride. For the Americans, it was a thrilling victory that imbued a fledgling nation with a deep, resounding sense of pride and unity, a victory that would echo through the streets of New Orleans and the annals of American history for generations to come. The tumultuous rebirth. New Orleans in the shadow of the Civil War and Reconstruction. As the Union forces swept into New Orleans in April 1862, the city's once vibrant Creole world began to unravel under the weight of war and occupation. General Benjamin F. Butler's arrival as military governor marked the beginning of a bitter chapter for New Orleans. The nickname Beast, Butler was coined after his harsh measures, particularly targeting women loyal to the Confederacy, and rumors of looting by Union troops painted him as a despised figure in the city's eyes. His orders to suppress French-language instruction in schools and impose English as the dominant language symbolized the broader cultural shift that would gradually erase the city's French roots by the end of the century. Although spared from the widespread destruction that ravaged other southern cities, New Orleans became a microcosm of the nation's painful transition. The Emancipation Proclamation largely bypassed the city at first, but it became a beacon for change. As former slaves and free people of color from both the city and surrounding rural areas joined the Union effort, the city saw the rise of the Corps d'Afrique, a predominantly black regiment that played a key role in the war's final years. Reconstruction, however, proved no less brutal than war itself. Violent uprisings like the New Orleans Riot of 1866 highlighted the deep divisions that still plagued the South, and the newly empowered federal government, through the Reconstruction Acts, sought to forge a new future of equality and citizenship. Under the 1868 Louisiana Constitution, New Orleans found itself at the center of a short-lived experiment in racial integration and political progress. The election of P.B.S. Pinchback, the first African American to serve as governor of any U.S. state, epitomized the brief yet transformative period of Reconstruction. Despite the promise of change, the systemic violence and racism that followed ensured that this vision would be undone by the end of the 1870s. Yet for a fleeting moment, New Orleans stood as a symbol of hope for the future of a unified, diverse nation, one that would ultimately have to wait another century to see those ideals fully realized. Decline and rebirth. New Orleans in the 20th century. Once a dominant force in the southern United States, New Orleans began its slow descent from its economic and population zenith in the 19th century. By 1860, the city stood as the nation's fifth largest, a bustling hub of commerce and culture, but the tides of change swiftly turned. The rise of railways and highways, along with the decline of river traffic, diverted vital trade routes and shrank New Orleans' influence as the center of southern industry and trade. The city's gradual decline was compounded by the Great Migration during and after World War II, when thousands of ambitious black residents sought better opportunities elsewhere, particularly on the West Coast. By the 20th century, New Orleans was no longer the preeminent city it once was. As cities like Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta surged in population, New Orleans' growth stagnated. The construction of highways and the expansion of suburban developments further siphoned people away from the urban core, contributing to the first population decline in 1970. The city's port, once the lifeblood of its economy, remained large but faced challenges due to automation and containerization, while New Orleans' financial dominance was overshadowed by larger, more dynamic cities. Despite efforts to revitalize the city, the economic successes of the mid-20th century under leaders like de Lesseps, Chep Morrison and Victor Vic Shiro were unable to reverse the decline. By the late 1960s, New Orleans had found itself a shadow of its former self, its economic growth rate trailing behind newer Sunbelt cities. Yet, beneath the surface of stagnation, the city's unique cultural identity remained, poised for future rebirth as it entered the latter half of the century. New Orleans, the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina. On August 29, 2005, New Orleans was thrust into the darkest chapter of its history when Hurricane Katrina, one of the most devastating natural disasters ever to strike the United States, ravaged the city. The storm's ferocity was matched only by the catastrophic failure of the city's federal flood protection system, which collapsed under the pressure of the storm's surge. Described as the worst engineering disaster in the world since Chernobyl by Raymond B. Seed, the failure of the levees and flood walls left 80% of New Orleans submerged. The city's residents, who had evacuated in droves, were confronted with an apocalyptic scene as the floodwaters engulfed homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. Thousands who had stayed behind sought refuge at the Louisiana Superdome and the New Orleans Memorial Convention Center, but rescue efforts were slow, and the situation grew dire. More than 1,500 lives were lost in Louisiana, with many more still missing or unaccounted for. In the wake of the disaster, New Orleans found itself grappling with the aftermath of both a natural and man-made tragedy that left an indelible scar on the city's landscape and soul. New Orleans proves that culture can't be drowned, not by floods, not by time. Now we want to hear your NOLA story. Family roots? Jazz Fest memories? Or just dream of beignet at Café du Monde? Drop your love below, and don't forget to subscribe for our next American City documentary.